Hello, hello, hello. Hi there. Welcome back. This is Daniel Kirsch, and I'm here to continue today to talk to you about the bureaucracy. I want to give you some additional background today to make sure you can appreciate just who the bureaucracy is and the difference between what the president has directly to do with it and what kind of electoral politics really have to do with it. So, a little bit of history behind how presidents and political parties have been able to use the bureaucracy to their advantage and reward their political supporters. And what extent this has changed over time is in order. So it certainly has changed. The first thing I want to do is go over a few numbers. So as all of you know, when we have a presidential election every year, the new president, every 4 years, a new president gets to a point where a certain number of people are called political appointees are appointed in every 4 years. They appoint people from the Secretary of State to the Secretary of Defense to the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. And a lot of the people in between are people like the Deputy Undersecretary for Operations in the Department of Agriculture. So all of those positions have to go through not only an appointment process by the President, but also a confirmation process by the Senate. And there are roughly 1,200 of these positions that are what's called Senate confirmable. And they are appointed by the president every 4 years. I just want to draw your attention to a little circle I've drawn around that, about 1,000, that smallest number, if you can see that in there, 1,000 confirmable. And beyond that is another circle. There are about 8,000 positions in total within the federal government that are considered purely political appointees. That is, they serve at the pleasure of the president, but they are not Senate confirmable. The president appoints them every 4 years, but most of them are not subject to a Senate confirmation. But what they're also not subject to are what are called civil service protections, where they're an employee and whoever the president is doesn't really matter. So, pardon me. In addition to those employees, there's also what we have that we include as our employees are active duty military employees. We'll call them employees for the sake of simplicity. Are enlisted men and women. There are essentially 1.3 million of these military members. So you've got and about a little under a million reservists as well. So you've got your active duty military and then 8,000 political appointees, and that's a lot of employees, and it will come back. I'll come back to these numbers in just a second, but I want to emphasize that all of these are simply counted as a small fraction of the total workers in the United States. Even if you added up the local government workers, 14 million, and state workers, about 5.5 million, that's about altogether 20 million, in addition to the roughly 3 or 4 million federal government employees. So only about 24, 25, I'm kind of inflating a little bit, but rounding up to 25 million total U.S. government employees out of, it's actually, as of the census this year, it's something like 147 million total workers in the United States. Let's see, so there's many large companies that people work for, many conglomerates, but the federal government is the largest single employer. So the largest single employer employs 3 million workers, and everyone else is kind of just keeping up. Without that, it's the number one employer in terms of the quantities of people. It's also a very good job to have if you work for the federal government and they're signing your paycheck. They have great pension benefits that are really better than almost anything in the private sector. Maybe the salary isn't quite as good, but it has a certain amount of job security, a lot of job security. And it's much like if any of you know people that work directly for the California state government, for example. It's really very similar to that. It's called civil service protection, and it means basically you have something like property rights to your job, meaning that if you're going to be fired, you're not actually what's called an at-will employee, which the majority of people are in the U.S., you're an employee with civil service protection, meaning if you're going to be terminated from your employment, your employer has to show, because you've demonstrated incompetence or some kind of malfeasance or moral turpitude. So that's another ball of wax. But in fact, a lot of K-12 school teachers and college and university professors have something similar. It's a protection called tenure. But they get it, through a process that usually lasts 5 to 6 years. But for federal government employees, there are a lot of people that are very diverse in terms of the base that forms the vast majority of federal government employees. But people work for things like the Department of Agriculture, to the park rangers in the National Park Service, physicians who work for various branches, and nurses as well. You have interpreters of various languages. You have civilian employees within the Department of Defense. You have all the postal employees, mail carriers, postal workers, everyone whose paycheck comes directly from the U.S. Department of the Treasury is a federal employee. All those people are federal employees. All of them have the ability to receive all the benefits that the federal government provides to its employees. And at least a large chunk of that had the option of joining something called a labor union within the federal government. There's one called the AFGE, the American Federation of Government Employees. Now, actually, not all government employees belong to a labor union, and many of them really do not. And not all of them are eligible to join a labor union. But it's also, some of them belong to other unions, like the American Postal Workers Union. Let's see, and I've not researched what their membership is, but people who are employed by the federal government, by far the largest is the AFGE. I believe they have something in the neighborhood of 300,000 members. So they have been able to pressure the U.S. government into giving them job protections. And these job protections work for anyone who works for, again, the Bureau of Justice Statistics and other bureaus. I had a few friends work for that bureau and the Bureau of Statistics in the Department of Labor. So there are a lot of opportunities to fill various jobs that you can make a career of in the federal government. So all of those are places that have employees that are often lifetime employees. They stay in their jobs for 15 or 20 or 30 years. So they can get invested in the federal retirement system and the pension system, which is even better than Social Security. They can have a secure income well into their retirement, as well as really marquee health care. I think that maybe the second only, I think they come in second only to actually health care packages for members of Congress themselves. They're usually considered a very, very highly skilled workforce before you get a job in the federal government. You need a lot of qualifications typically, so not anyone can just sign up and get one. You need to pass a criminal background check, and of course you also need to be highly skilled in some area. They have hiring seasons for positions like engineers and other highly skilled professionals. So these types of positions often get really, really good signing packages. So, all right, so that's what the federal government does in terms of incentivizing people to come and work for them. So I want to shift gears a little bit, and in addition to that very large that workforce of at least 500 or 1,000 people that work for the West Wing and the White House, they work kind of as advisors to the president and as experts and administrative assistants, things like that. So all those kinds of jobs are not really the vast majority of federal government jobs. So again, I was just referring to the West Wing of the White House, like 500 to 1,000 people. As you can see, that's a pretty small fraction even of what has to be considered a federal employee, which is just in this kind of 3 million range. So it's just a very different, maybe highly romanticized version of working for the federal government, is working for the president. And there are people who populate places like the National Drug Control Policy Board, National Economic Council, all those places that are talked about in the executive branch, that are part of the executive office of the president. So throughout the cabinet, there are 8,000 of these positions that actually just have to be restaffed and rehired every 4 years. But these upper-level management positions are the ones that the Senate confirmable secretaries of all the departments, 15 of those, and those secretaries and their deputy secretaries are all the people who really have direct leadership for policy, and they're directed subsequently by the president and Congress. So they're the ones who really create policy directions for all of the employees that we're talking about in the federal government. So of these, when I talk about political appointees, I talk mostly about government employees in history. I'm really talking about this circle of people, okay, the 8,000 political people. And it has a really long history. And as far as American political history can be called long, but initially the federal government and its employees were thought to be people who were just, of course, highly educated and by definition very wealthy. And there were only, in the Federalist government of George Washington and John Adams, led in part by Alexander Hamilton, they thought they would only hire someone of really high education, right, who had gone to, at that point, Harvard and Columbia and Yale all existed. So these positions were highly skilled, and they were highly skilled in matters like war and also financial and legal matters. But the federal government was a small speck of sand on the modern kind of beach and ocean of the federal government. So I'd be surprised if there were 8,000 federal government employees total, or maybe a few dozen, during the Washington and Adams administrations. And that really started to change after that first 12 years. And then Jefferson came to power. He started to fill those positions with people who were political allies. He fired all the Federalists, all the Hamilton, Adams, Washington allies, because they were at-will employees, and they were served at the pleasure of the president, as they say. And as we say these days, you replace them with what you would call Jeffersonians. And in 1801, but then over the next 27, 28 years, things began to get kind of back to normal. The highly educated kind of rose to the top. And former Federalists kind of crept back in. Their research returned to the ethos of only hiring the best and the brightest, no matter what their affiliation or beliefs. And this began to be called the era of good feelings. Everyone basically belonged to the same political party, kind of post-Jeffersonians, and the party itself was thought to have different wings, old and new, or kind of more like the Federalists and more like the Jeffersonians. And parties were something from the past, but this wasn't really, sustainable. It wasn't a permanent change. One person who symbolically at least helped that change along after that 28-year era of good feelings, who lent his name to an era, was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a person who was elected at this time when a lot of states were freeing up a lot of their voting procedures and restrictions, to the point where initially the people who voted were just the people who were all white, and there were a lot of restrictions so that only white male property owners could vote. So because of that difficulty in establishing any kind of widespread voting access, there was fundamentally a real lack of democracy. The thing is, when states like New York and Virginia began to abolish their property qualifications, that's when we should take, the fact that this was not a democracy, or the fact that it was a democracy, with a grain of salt. So we did get to universal white male suffrage, which at the time was maybe the majority, but maybe not. It was an improvement, but not really still democracy from our vantage point. So all the white males were now essentially eligible to vote, which in hindsight means, very small, and was kind of almost a laughable part of the population in terms of patriarchy and racial superiority, and certainly economic discrimination. However, that at the time, it at least doubled and tripled the number of people in many cases who were eligible to vote in these states. So it was somewhat of a step forward. But there was also a class element where the wealthy landowners were not only the only people now who were able to vote in elections and had their voices heard, but also had their interests represented in government. And so these people like Andrew Jackson really had to reach out to them to get their vote, to change the conversation about politics, because it brought new interests and new issues to the bargaining table. So people who had been excluded they expanded the sphere of voting simply because they were now eligible to vote. Non-landowning white males were now eligible to vote. And people like Jackson and his lieutenant Martin Van Buren reached out to these voters because they were now eligible and they could now count in the vote totals. So they were an easier way to get more votes, was to get the new people and persuade them to your side, as opposed to changing the minds of the people who already were voting. So when did this happen? Because it really changed government. So Jackson, he ushered in this era of what became known as the spoils system, because he relied upon this old saying from politics and more in Western Europe, that in those countries, after a war, to the victor go the spoils. And so the spoils system was the system whereby you could simply fire everyone who was in the government at the time and replace them with your allies. And there were no women employed by the federal government at the time, to my knowledge. So he replaced them with his allies. And spoils system starting in 1828 and 29 when Jackson was inaugurated. And as president started this whole era of whoever is president really gets to staff the federal government and kind of capture the federal government. And it really solidified the division between the two political parties. So the Jackson Party became known as the Democratic Party, and the Republicans were a generation later the opposition party. But they were first known as the Whigs, from an old British parliamentary name. They called Jackson a tyrant, so they took that name Whig from British parliamentary history. And that was they were opposed, Whigs in history, were opposed to the king's kind of one-person rule. I'm not going to write their name right now and give you their whole party history, but they eventually grew into the Republicans when they adopted, at least the northern branch did, when they adopted an anti-slavery stance and began to accept, people who had been Jacksonian Democrats but were against slavery in the North. That became the new Republican Party. But it was an important thing to mention about the Jackson Party, just because the Democratic Party was called the Democratic Party doesn't mean it's the same kind of Democratic Party it is today. So just because there were more white males that were allowed to be in the party, primarily the Democratic Party during this era, during the kind of post-Civil War era, it was less like the Democratic Party today and more like its own kind of segregationist and certainly pro-slavery party before the Civil War and then after the Civil War as well. Jackson certainly had a lot of plantation owners on his side and slave owners who were his constituents and party members, and he was one himself. And what's important to realize during this era is the federal government was growing, and it was kind of shifting to this kind of amorphous thing. And states were still seen as more or less on equal footing with the federal government, even during this era. And of course, this mentality led partially to the Civil War between 1861 and 65. So Lincoln, in those years, and then eventually in the next election after the Civil War began, he ran for president. And after the Civil War, he'd won 2 elections. And so during that 16-year period that began then, the Republicans really grew to depend on the federal government as a reward or spoil system for their supporters. So Jackson's kind of long-term opponents, the Republicans, really ended up reaping the benefits of this spoil system, to the point where the military, like all the officers in the military, were essentially Republicans and became Republicans during the war, before the war, during the war, and after the war. It was really the Republican Party that waged and won that war in the form it was at that point. So during that 16-year period from 1860 to 1876, stay with me, the Republicans really grew to depend on the federal government as that spoil system for their supporters, as a way to just do business and function as a political party. So in 1876, when it looks like the Democrats might have won narrowly but legitimately, the Republicans kind of made a deal with the Democrats and said, look, we know you might have won this election, but if you can award us these electors and allow us to have one more term, and we'll see what happens next time, but we're just saying for this next term, in 1877 to 81, we can pull all of our troops out of the South, which we want to do anyway, because too many people have been there for too long and we spent so much money on this whole Reconstruction idea, that you can go back to running the South the way you see fit, bringing back slavery in all but name. So that was the deal, and that's what the South did, at least for a time. And so we'll go over this more in some of the other chapters, but what it did is removed the federal election monitors, who were just soldiers really, but still, they were federal election monitors from the South, and allowed what became known as the Jim Crow laws, the segregation laws that prevented, in most cases, black people from voting in the South until the Civil Rights Movement almost a century later. So anyway, that's a side note. Unfortunately, from 1876 and then 80 again, Rutherford B. Hayes, as a result, is not a popular president. He was not renominated, but James Garfield of Ohio, stay with me, this is important. James Garfield of Ohio, he was also a member of Congress, the leader in Congress, but he was just a member, and he'd just been elected to the Senate in Ohio. He hadn't even taken office yet as a senator. But Ohio was one of the biggest states, and they were beginning their little Ohio dynasty that was happening of presidents from Ohio. And all these presidents from Hayes to, Grant was from Ohio, Hayes, Garfield were all from Ohio. And there were more Ohio presidents to come. So it's a really important state to win, as we'll see. But Garfield had been elected to the Senate and stayed, by all accounts. He was kind of a brilliant person. He was a college professor by age 21. Whereas today, the bare minimum to be one is probably around age 28 or 29. That's really a kind of a genius person already. And the average age is like 34. So he went to all these top schools in the country. He was certainly anti-slavery. He had been a major and officer in the Civil War. He was very qualified. He was also really against the spoils system, but he was not somebody who really enjoyed that part of politics. He had more of an intellectual appreciation for it. So there had been an effort by Grant, actually, to recapture the nomination in 1880. Grant had been president after, being a general in the Civil War. He had been president for 8 years, and in a time when he did send soldiers to fight the Ku Klux Klan, but he allowed his administration to be really corrupt and corrupted by railroad magnates, and kind of a spoils system / campaign finance kind of scandal. But he still held a lot of followers in the party, and there was no term limits. So he was trying to get back into office in 1880. And Grant was still alive, and I believe at that point he was bankrupt, and later on he had to write his memoirs while he was still dying of cancer to be able to save his family's well-being for after he died. And so he positioned his family well to provide for them after his death, and he wrote what are usually called some of the best presidential memoirs, maybe the best set of presidential memoirs out there. So before the days of presidential pensions, and to look after his family's fortune, which didn't exist yet. So anyway, at that time the spoils system functioned for Republicans in a way that was really a reward for really wealthy industrialists. So this, as I mentioned, his administration was very scandal-ridden. But it proved too much of a barrier to his renomination in 1880. But the pro-Grant faction had a group of wealthy northern industrialists nominating Chester Arthur of New York, whose job it was to actually give out patronage jobs. That's what they're called, spoils system jobs or patronage jobs, for Republican allies at the Port of New York, which was where most taxes were collected before the days of income taxes, preceded income taxes by about 30 years. Let's see, just to wrap this up, hang on a second. So James Garfield, brilliant scholar, leader in Congress, was nominated by Republicans, won, but he was shot by a disaffected job seeker in Washington in 1881 in July. It wasn't a fatal wound, but the swampy air and the lack of antibiotics and unsanitary medical practices led to his death from those injuries. In September of that year, Chester Arthur became president. Ironically, as the chief dispenser of political jobs as the collector of the Port of New York, he signed the Pendleton Act, which undermined that job, instituting the civil service system as a result of the national outrage of a job seeker who would be motivated to kill the president. And later presidents like Franklin Roosevelt, who was the first president elected with significant labor union support in 1932, began to once more use the federal government jobs as a reward for his political supporters. Things progressed like that, increasing the number of political jobs in the federal government until the PATCO strike in 1981, when Reagan, after his assassination attempt and his recovery, at kind of riding a wave of popularity, fired striking air traffic controllers. So this labor union, PATCO, was basically just the union of air traffic controllers who really felt like they had a lot of leverage because these are jobs nobody wants that you need highly qualified people in. But instead of bargaining with them, he just fired them when they refused to return to work because legally speaking, they couldn't strike, but they could do a work stoppage where they all called in sick. But he refused to negotiate with them, and the federal government then signaled it was no longer willing to be a willing partner in labor management collective bargaining agreements and negotiations. And the Trump administration, before the current Biden administration, recently unilaterally reduced the percentage of time that federal government employees could devote to labor union work as a part of their employment. In other words, if you're elected as an officer in a union and your job is to function as an elected leader by your fellow members, you're not allowed to spend very much time doing that work and still be compensated for it. So you kind of have to do two jobs in a very real sense. So the people who have elected you are prevented from having effective representation is one kind of consequence of that. So that's really the story of bureaucracy and federal employment. In many ways, it's shortchanging many aspects of it, but I hope it gives you a broad overview of the way that presidents have led the way, at least, in kind of this whole employment scheme of who's a bureaucrat and who's not, and what kind of jobs are protected and how many are not. So what's not up here is 300,000 union employees, but probably closer to 400,000 or 500,000 as a percentage of that 2.1 million. But they are not Senate confirmable. Those are civil service employees. So keep in mind when you talk about federal government employees, there are several different, very, very distinct constituencies that you're talking about. It is the largest employer, but it's not gargantuan. It's 3 million out of 150 million workers, and remember, local government workers far outnumber federal government workers. And another takeaway is that only 1,000 of these are political appointments that are also Senate confirmable, and another 8,000, another 7,000 are just political appointees that have no Senate confirmation necessary. So when we're talking about political appointees, yes, the president can make a big impact because he or she can appoint managers and policy directors of a lot of these departments, but you're barely scratching the surface of the federal government. 99% of the employees just stay, and it's only some of the managers that are chosen from time to time when a new president is elected. So that's what's vulnerable. The rest are relatively protected from political winds that blow. So if you have questions about this, please let me know. Otherwise, this has been the bureaucracy chapter for the American government course that we're teaching and learning together. And let me know if you have questions. Otherwise, thanks for watching.